An expedition to find the Northwest Passage, the latest attempt in hundreds of years of exploration. The two ships that were part of the expedition, headed up by Sir John Franklin, were some of the sturdiest, hardiest ships available to the British Navy, the Hms Terror and the Hms Erebus. The ships set sail from Kent on May 19, 1845, stopping at the Orkney Islands and then Greenland. On July 28th, the two ships were spotted by a pair of whalers in Baffin Bay. This would be the last time the 129 men would be seen alive by any Europeans. The ships would vanish without a trace. Over the course of the next 150 years, there were many efforts to find them, or find out what happened to them. There were clues left behind, the Victory Point note, evidence of where people had taken shelter, oral histories from the Inuit who inhabited the area. Despite the best efforts, what really happened to the men on that ship was never found out, but there are a number of theories as to what did happen. Today we ask the question, whatever happened to the Franklin expedition? Throughout the history of Canada, certain events are always highlighted and are well enshrined in our collective memory, be it the War of 1812, the Battle of Vimy Ridge, the creation of Canada in 1867, or the 1972 Summit Series. And while much of the history of Canada is solidly rooted in fact, there are a number of stories which leave more questions than answers. There is a part of the history of Canada, even the land before Canada as a country existed, that is filled with mystery, legend, myths, and stories that shiver the soul. These stories are just as important as the ones we all know about, and we will be telling one of those stories today. Welcome to Canadian History After Dark. The search for a Northwest Passage around North America to connect Asia to Europe had been a goal of explorers for centuries. Many efforts had been undertaken and failed. These voyages, however, would add to the knowledge of what existed on the northern shores of what would become Canada. By the time the Franklin expedition was set to head off, really all that was left to be explored was roughly 181,000 square kilometers. Of course, the Arctic archipelago covers an area of roughly 1.4 million square kilometers, so it may seem like a small percentage that was left to be charted. Still, it was a pretty sizable space, comparable to something like the nation of Bulgaria or even Iceland itself. The area that was left was located west of Lancaster Sound. It wasn't known if there was a way through the ice and land, however, but it was still thought there could potentially be a Northwest Passage. This most recent expedition was given to the command of John Franklin. Franklin was no stranger to the Canadian Arctic. In 1819, he was in charge of the Coppermine expedition. This trek went overland from Hudson Bay to chart the coast towards the Coppermine River, which flows from Lac de Gras to the Coronation Gulf, 845 kilometers away. This expedition took 3 years, returning in 1822. Along the way, 11 men died. This was a party of just 20. There was a murder throughout the expedition, and there were also reports of cannibalism, but this was never confirmed. In 1825, Franklin would take part in another expedition, exploring the Mackenzie River, becoming the second European to reach the mouth of that particular river. He would spend part of the next 2 years in the Canadian Arctic before returning to England. It is noteworthy that Franklin, in his diary from the expedition, described his men as playing hockey on the ice of Great Bear Lake during the trek. The preparations for the voyage into the Canadian Arctic on the Franklin expedition in 1845 included refitting the Erebus and the Terror. These ships were already quite sturdy, having been rocket ships, that is, used to fire Congreve rockets, which required hulls that were very well built. In fact, the Erebus and the Terror were part of the reason how the American national anthem came to be, as they were the rocket ships that were involved during the Battle of Fort McHenry during the War of 1812. Now, the hulls were doubled. Bows were 8 feet thick to add some reinforcement. There was a protective layer of sheet iron, and steam engines were added in along with screw propellers. There was enough in the way of provisions for 3 years on each of the ships, and they had tin canisters that were to be used for charting paper records. And these canisters would be deposited to help other ships in case a search was needed if the expedition had any issues. Now, the ships were crewed, and this was an Arctic voyage, so they were looking to go through the Northwest Passage and also chart the magnetic pole. However, not everybody who was coming along had experience in the Arctic. Now, the ice masters, these were guys who were in charge of measuring thickness of ice, when they would have to kind of shelter for a period of time, like for the winter and such, were James Reed and Thomas Blanky, and they were veterans of voyages to the Arctic. But of the other 16 officers, only 6 had made a voyage that far north. It was actually considered to be one of the least experienced expeditions to the Arctic ever sent by the British Admiralty. Now, as we said, the ships left England on May 19, 1845, and first went to the Orkney Islands and then to Greenland. In late July, 2 whalers would meet up with the Erebus and the Terror in Baffin Bay. The explorers were waiting for weather to improve so they could cross Lancaster Sound, and this would be the last time any Europeans saw the 129 men. The details of what happened next are recounted only by scant pieces of information, with a number of questions still remaining about what had happened. The only primary source remaining, other than any records that were found, such as diaries, was what was known as the Victory Point Note, and that would be found years later. So what is known about the Franklin expedition? Well, they spent the winter of 1845-46 on Beechey Island. 3 crew members would pass away during the winter, and they were buried on the island. The next summer, they would set sail through Peel Sound before becoming trapped in ice in September of 1846. And it's believed that the 2 ships never sailed again after that. The crew was stuck near King William Island until 1848, when the remaining crew, who were still alive after 3 grueling winters in the Arctic, decided to go overland to the Back River on the Canadian mainland. By this time, however, they were without their leader. Franklin passed away in June of 1847. Of the 129 men who had started out on the voyage, at this point in 1848, only 105 were still alive. And it's believed that around 30 men had actually made their way back to the mainland, but were still hundreds of kilometers away from any civilization. Now, 2 years after the expedition left England, with no word coming back, even through those tin canisters that were brought along to drop in case of information needed to be relayed back about troubles for the voyage, people started to become concerned. And by the spring of 1848, search parties were underway. One went overland down the Mackenzie River, and other 2 went by sea. There's also a £20,000 reward offered by the Admiralty for any information about the expedition. By 1850, there were 11 British and 2 American ships that were searching in the Arctic. More and more ships would join the search, and clues would be found. They discovered remnants of the camp on Beechey Island. And then more information came forward in 1854. During a survey of the Boothia Peninsula in the Canadian Arctic in 1854, more information was learned from an Inuk man near Pelly Bay. He told of the expedition that was headed up by John Ray. There was a party of about 40 men who died of starvation near the Back River. There were reports of cannibalism amongst those men as well. Now, to corroborate the story, the Inuit of the area showed the objects they had recovered from the scene. This included forks and spoons that had belonged to the officers of the ships. Ray sent his report back to the Admiralty, who then urged the Hudson's Bay Company to send an expedition to look for the men along the Back River. 2 men from the HBC in 1855 met with a group of Inuit who told of the men who had died along the coast. These men from the HBC, James Anderson and James Stewart, would find a piece of wood with the word Erebus inscribed on it, and the name of the Erebus's doctor, Mr. Stanley, on Montreal Island, which was where the Back River flowed into the Arctic Ocean. On March 31st, 1854, however, the British Admiralty declared the ships lost at sea and ended all searches for them. Franklin's wife, however, was not ready to give up. She commissioned another search under the command of Francis Leopold McClintock out of her own pocket. The ship, a steam schooner called the Fox, would reach King William Island, and a crew would discover a cairn that included 2 messages left by the Erebus and the Terror. These messages were called the Victory Point Notes. One was dated May 28, 1847. It stated that the ships had wintered off the northwest coast of King William Island and that all was well. A month after that note was left in the cairn, Franklin would pass away. The second note was written in the margins of the first, dated April 25, 1848. It explained that the ships had been stuck in the ice for a year and a half, and that the ships had been abandoned on April 22nd. It detailed everything that had happened up until that point as well as they could in the margins, and that 105 men were on foot towards the back river. A skeleton was also found, fully clothed on King William Island. A certificate on the body said that it was that of Harry Pegler, but it's believed to have actually been that of the gunroom steward, Thomas Armitage. Then 2 more bodies were found in a lifeboat. There was also a large amount of equipment that had been left behind. This included things like boots, soap, hair combs, and books. Further expeditions over the years would find a few more graves, along with some relics from the Franklin expedition, but no further clues as to what had happened. That is until some reports surfaced during the 1860s of at least 2 men from the expedition, including the captain of the Terror, Francis Crozier, being seen as late as 1858 near Baker Lake. That myth, though, was never confirmed. Now, legends and theories abound as to what happened to the men. First of all, we'll look at the food. They had 3 years' worth of supplies, but it turns out the food may have been spoiled all along. It was improperly canned, and the food would have been a rotten mess when they went to eat it. So that wouldn't have helped the survival odds of the expedition. Then the tales of cannibalism. Now, these were rumors at first, but there was evidence found on some of the bodies that were discovered of cannibalism. And there was also the testimony of the Inuit in the area that confirmed it. Now, did these men resort to eating each other in order to stay alive? And what of the stories of Crozier and another man being seen near Baker Lake, some 4 to upwards of 10 years after abandoning the ships? Baker Lake is some 450 kilometers due south of King William Island. That's no easy trek to make without food. Did Crozier have assistance? There are some stories that have been passed on from the Inuit that Crozier stayed with them, learned to live off the land from them, and then tried to make his way south before eventually succumbing to the Arctic. The story of the Franklin expedition has been the subject of movies, books, songs, and even a television series. People have tried to figure out why everything that could go wrong went wrong. What of the ships themselves? The search for the expedition covered much of the waters around King William Island, yet no traces of the ships themselves was ever found. That is, until recent history. It wouldn't be for another 170 years before the ships were discovered. It was announced in September of 2014 that they had found the wreck of the Erebus. The ship was found southwest of O'Reilly Island in the Queen Maud Gulf. This area is some 100 kilometers southwest of King William Island. The Terror, however, was not there. It would take 2 more years of searching before the Terror was discovered. The ship was found south of King William Sound in what is now known as Terror Bay, 2 years to the day that the Erebus was found. The Canadian Arctic has long been a harsh climate for those who have tried to explore it. The biting cold, the moving ice, the driving winds, and more have meant a dangerous trek for most who have sought to map it. The Franklin expedition was one that was guided by hubris of sorts. You had a man who was suited for polar exploration, but he had a relatively inexperienced crew. And Franklin was also not even the second choice, but the third choice to lead the expedition, as his past experiences in the Arctic did have many wondering if he would be able to lead this one. And then you also had the food that was bad, and they were looking to chart areas that Europeans had never seen before. And of course, there's always the weather that you have to contend with when you're in the Arctic archipelago, and when you're from Britain trying to deal with conditions that you've never seen before, as the majority of the crew of the Franklin expedition had seen, then things would always be tough. The Franklin expedition is a great reminder that the Arctic is a beast all to its own, and attempts to conquer it rarely succeed. Now, this week our episode is again a little shorter than normal, and a little bit later than normal as well. And this again is due to some of the scheduling with day-to-day life. But once again, we're going to be getting back to a regular schedule very shortly. Now, coming up on Sunday, we'll have our next episode of our series Acadia Lost, as we continue to look at the story of the Acadians, leading from their development of the Acadian culture to the eventual expulsion of the Acadians by the British during the 18th century. And then coming up on our next episode of Canadian History After Dark, we'll be exploring some of the myths surrounding, some more of the legends surrounding the Weyburn Mental Hospital, also known as the Souris Valley Hospital, that existed here in the city of Weyburn for a number of years. A lot of stories have come from that, and there's a lot of legends and even a little bit of fascinating history in general that comes from the hospital here in Weyburn. Like and follow us on social media. This includes Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Check out our YouTube and become a subscriber as we bring more and more video content in the coming weeks. And also visit our website, CanadianHistoryPodcast.ca. You can also support us on Patreon, and we have started a GoFundMe to help support our endeavors. And follow along the podcast on your favorite platform. We bring you 2 episodes a week. One is Canadian History After Dark, and the other is our ongoing anthology series that looks at various events from Canadian history that may not be as well known nationally as they are regionally. And thank you for listening to Canadian History After Dark.